What's up guys, my name is Jeremy and welcome to chapter 0, what is 3D? In this video we're going to talk about a bunch of different 3D topics as an introduction for anyone who's brand new or curious or just wants to get a sense of the lay of the land. I'm going to help you get your bearings. So in this video we're going to talk about what is 3D, how is it done, some key concepts, and what are the software tools used to make it here in 2025. This information is not software specific and is universal to all 3D programs. The way I like to explain 3D is to first compare it to 2D. So here we have a simplified depiction of the board game Battleship, if you ever played that as a kid. And in this case, we've got a grid and we've got two axes. We've got letters going from left to right, and we've got numbers going from top to bottom. So we've got two axes. For our purpose, we're going to label the up and down axis as the y-axis, and the left and right axis will be x. So in this game, you're supposed to guess where the enemy ships are, and you call it a coordinate by saying something like B8, and the enemy responds hit or miss. This is an example of a two-coordinate system. So 3D is simply the addition of a third coordinate, the z-axis. And as soon as we have the z-axis, now we can get depth. And as you can see, as soon as you can start plotting points in space that allow for depth, you get a much more believable looking object in space. This is the exact same game board, but now in 3 dimensions. So with this XYZ coordinate system, we can now start plotting points in space. Any 3 values can be plotted as a point in space, including negatives. At its most basic, this is the fundamental core concept that you need to understand about working in 3D. So, just to demonstrate this as an example, here are 3 RGB sliders from any 2D drawing program like Photoshop. In this case, we have red, green, and blue. Red 206, green 222, and blue 106. We can actually plot this vomit color in 3D space because it's an XYZ coordinate. And so color itself can be modeled in 3D. In this example, we've got a bunch of different colors positioned in space based on their RGB values. So we have black at 000, we have white at 255 by 255 by 255, and every other color in between. And again, this is just to illustrate the point that any 3 values can be plotted as a point in space. Here, we can see another representation of color as a 3D form, and again, as another form, in this case, a cylinder. And finally, an even more complex representation of color as a 3D shape. These are the 3D primitives: cube, cylinder, sphere, and plane. With these shapes, you can model anything in the world, anything that you can put your mind to. And ultimately, at its most basic, the cube is probably the most powerful 3D primitive that there is. What are these primitives made out of? Let's talk about the anatomy of 3D objects. These lines we call edges. The points themselves we call vertices, and the area bounded by these vertices and edges we call faces. A 4-sided face we call a quad, and a 3-sided face we call a tri. These are 2 of the most important shapes that you need to know in 3D, and they're the basic building blocks of any 3D model. But ultimately there's only one king, and the most basic unit of a 3D model is actually the tri. The reason being that a quad can be split into 2 triangles. Every quad is made up of 2 triangles, which makes the true basic unit of 3D models the triangle. So sometimes you'll hear about polycount or tricount. Tricount is actually the more accurate term to use because everything can be divided into triangles. This irregular face we call an NGON. An NGON is any face with more than 4 edges, and is generally taught to new 3D artists that NGONs are bad, that they should be avoided, the NGONs are the devil. But notice that I have a big asterisk next to bad, because there are situations when you get a little more advanced that NGONs can be used to your advantage, and I'll try to provide some examples of that. But if you don't know what you're doing, you probably should avoid them because they can create pretty bad rendering and shading artifacts. So for now, NGONs are bad and quads are good. Here we have 2 spheres, and I want you to look good and hard because I want to know if you can tell a difference between these 2 shapes. This was a test given to us on my first day of 3D modeling school back in the day. And the teacher asked, can you tell me what the difference is between these 2 balls? And the answer is there isn't really much of a difference on the surface. If we look a little closer at the actual wireframe of the mesh, you'll see that there is quite a big difference. And the difference here is that the sphere on the left is made up of 576 polygons, and the sphere on the right is made up of 100,000 polygons. So what is the lesson? The lesson here is that silhouette is extremely important, and that you should use the amount of polygons that are appropriate or needed to describe the silhouette in a clean fashion. However, there is a point of diminishing returns where the more polygons doesn't necessarily help to make the form look better. So even though both of these spheres look similar, one of them is a lot more performant than the other, a lot less taxing on your machine, a lot less calculations required, a lot smoother overall. We call this Polycount. Here we have two planes, and actually they're the same plane, but the one on the left is a lot more jagged and stepped, whereas the one on the right is nice and smooth. We call this low poly and high poly. This process of taking the plane on the left and making it nice and smooth is what we call subdivision, or sub-D. During subdivision, what happens is that the computer divides each one of these faces into 4 per subdivision level. So if we were to divide every face on this model by 4, that would be subdivision 1. You can do it as many times as you want. You can get sub D2, sub D3, or sub D4, sub D5. It goes on and on. And not only does it divide the faces, but you can see that it averages out this curve, and that's why we get this smooth end result. I want to take a moment to introduce you to subdivision modeling and why it has unique considerations. So here I've got a basic primitive cube, and I've subdivided it 3 times. The result is a ball. If I take that same cube and I add an edge loop around the top of the box and around the bottom of the box, the result is a lot different. In fact, it's no longer a ball, it's a cylinder. The reason this is happening is because in the process of subdividing, the algorithm averages between the points on the model. So if you look at the corners of the first box, after subdivision, these points were rounded. However, in the second case, because I've added a support loop near the top of the box and near the bottom of the box, the algorithm is averaging between points that are much closer together. As a result, we get a much tighter and crisper edge near the top and the bottom of the box due to what we call a reinforcing edge near the top and bottom of the primitive. If I add another support edge loop, let's say to the left side of this box, you can see that it's now tightening up the left side of the cylinder. Whereas before the corners were rounded, now due to this reinforcing edge added to the left side, we have a much tighter edge on the subdivided model. And finally, if I add an edge loop to the front and back of the box, we get a tight cornered box all over. Essentially, we're using extra edge loops to control the subdivision smoothing. This is the fundamental concept behind subdivision modeling. This is also why the cube is such a powerful primitive, because from one primitive, we got a ball, a cylinder, and a box. This is all thanks to what we sometimes call fencing edges, reinforcing edges, triple edges, or control edges. I've heard all of it. Subdivision modeling is the modeling technique for feature film and animation. As we can see from this rendered result, this is where you start to notice the beautiful highlights that subdivision modeling can achieve. Just to cover another example, this time we have a cylinder and I've subdivided this object twice. This is the result. By adding a reinforcing edge near the bottom of that cylinder, you can see that it starts to sharpen up. Again, if I add a reinforcing edge near the top, you can see how it starts to sharpen up. And finally, to sharpen the top and bottom planes of the cylinder even further, you can add a reinforcing edge on the inside. Notice that without the reinforcing edges on the primitive cylinder, we get a lot of ugliness in the subdivided version. We can see that the model is starting to buckle and spoke at the top and the bottom. We call this a high valence point, and that's when there are a lot of edges converging on one vertice. But as we add reinforcing edges to the cylinder, it gets nice and sharp. Let's take a look at a slightly more complex model. On the left, we have a fairly basic model with no reinforcing edges applied, and on the right, we have the same model but with fully reinforced edges, built for subdivision modeling. If we flip back and forth, you can see that the default nature of subdivision is to become pillowy and rounded, and we lose all definition of plane changes. On the other hand, the model on the right looks great and has all the crispiness that we expect. Notice how readable and clear the change of planes are on this form. And real quick, let's just see it from another view. As you can see, we're losing all definition on the bottom, and really the telltale sign of a good subdivision model is that it shouldn't pop. One of the main reasons to subdivide the model at all is to get nice, smooth forms that look more realistic. Also, having more polygons for light rays to hit leads to much smoother bevels and beautiful highlights. Subdivided models can lead to millions and millions of polygons. That is why subdivision happens at render time. While you're working in the program in the viewport, you're generally working with a lower poly or medium poly resolution of the mesh. And finally, these are the 3 main states of polygonal modeling. On the left, we have a video game mesh, which is built up of tris. In the middle, we have the base mesh built up of quads. And on the right, we have the film and animation model built for sub-D. A really important concept to grasp is that 3D models are completely hollow. You can think of them as a balloon filled with air. They're essentially an illusion, and that is why 3D models are very prone to passing through and intersecting each other, because there's no collision unless you put it there. Another feature of 3D models that you're going to hear about over and over again is what we call normals. A normal is a line or direction that shoots out perpendicularly from the center of every face. Here they're depicted as little green lines, and you can toggle these on or off in any 3D program. Normals can serve many different functions, but at its most basic, normals tell the computer which way a surface is pointing. So the model on the right-hand side has its normals pointing outwards, and the model on the left-hand side has its normals pointing inwards, or inside out. And why this is important is because when we start to shoot light rays at this model to light it, the light rays need to know how and where they're going to bounce off a surface, and that is what the normal information will tell it. So normals serve an absolutely critical role, and it's one of the ways that we get really high detail inside of video games. Next, we're going to cover 3 important terms that we'll hear a lot. Topology, the overall arrangement and flow of your polygons. In general, this is referring to the technical aspects of your 3D model and not so much the artistic sculpting of it. Edge flow, the path and distribution of edges. So if we take a look at the image on the left, we can see that there's a deliberate placement of the edges along the contour of forms. So for example, here along the orange and purple patch, we can see that these edges are following the contour of this eye bag. Or we can take a look at the nasolabial fold. There's a purple and red border between these two forms going all the way down the mouth. So the placement of edges on this model are very deliberate, and they're there to support animation and movement. And retopology. So retopology is essentially the remodeling of the model, but with a focus on optimizing deformation and performance. So basically helping the model move better and reducing the poly count. Allow me to demonstrate why retopology is important. Here we have a 3D portrait that I made, and in its current state, it has 1.8 million vertices. If we take a peek under the hood and look at the geometry of the model, we can see that it's a chaotic mess. Not only that, but the mesh is extremely dense. So to improve the performance of the model and make it easier to work with for every step after this, we retopologize to simplify and reorganize the polygons while retaining the same form. As you're doing this, particularly for the face, it's very important to consider the natural rhythms and curves of the body. You can see that the polygons are working with and respecting the natural flows and forms of the face. Bad topology completely disregards these considerations and actively works against the forms. This video by Hippodrome demonstrates the benefits of having clean topology that supports a wide range of movement. The model maintains its quality during deformation. All of this information obviously needs to be stored somehow. So here are 4 of the most common 3D file types: OBJ, FBX, STL, and ABC. OBJ contains just the 3D model with a reference link to a separate material file. This is the most basic of the 3D file types. FBX, on the other hand, is one of the most versatile 3D file types that contains the model, color texture, material, rig, bones, lights, and cameras. Pretty much everything. So you can think of FBX as the catch-all file that can be shared across applications. STL files are used for 3D printing, and not all 3D programs can open them. And lastly, we have ABC, also known as an Alembic file cache. This is the go-to file for baked animation, whether that's character, cloth simulation, or particle simulation. I want to demonstrate for you what one of these 3D files looks like under the hood. I've exported this model as an OBJ, and it comes with an associated material file. I can take this 3D OBJ file, drag it into any text editor like Notepad, and what we get is a massive list of 3D point data. Remember, XYZ. Every single one of these lines here represents one point on this model in space. So 3D programs like Maya, Blender, Houdini, 3D Max can take this data and interpret it as a 3D model that can be rendered in space. The key takeaway here is that every vertex on your model, no matter how simple or complex, is stored as a number in a file. Every vertex is individual and has a name, and you can toggle that on and off in every program. As you can see here, every vertex is now labeled 0, 5, 1, 6, 7, 8, 2, 4, 3. We call these Vertex IDs. And even though we're generally not aware of this information, this is exactly how the computer sees the 3D file. And this leads me to my final point about the anatomy of 3D objects. Because every vertex has an ID and a location in 3D space, it means that you can keep track of those vertices if they change. And that means we can give 3D objects memory. This is what we call a Blendshape. We started with a flat primitive plane, and we stored 3 different human faces into its memory. And the reason this works is that so long as the vertex IDs don't change, we can give them updated positions. In this case, we've given all the vertices on this plane 3 new positions to remember in addition to its default state of being a plane. And these so-called blend shapes are a key component of animation. So we have now covered all of the key aspects of what a 3D model is. 3D models are floating points in space that are shaped like things. The type of 3D we've been focusing on is mainly used for entertainment purposes, video games and films and animation. Some of the key programs in 3D are Houdini, Maya, 3D Max, Cinema 4D, ZBrush, Blender, Modo, Lightwave, and SketchUp. Modo is deprecated now and Lightwave is less common, but once upon a time, these were some of the most popular 3D programs. Houdini is one of the most sophisticated 3D programs of today, and generally speaking is for the more advanced user. By far, Houdini has the highest skill cap, And while the UI can look very intimidating with its node graph, once you get familiar with it, you realize that it's the most flexible 3D program out there. We looked at some universal 3D file types already, but each of these programs has its own native file type. Houdini has HIP, Maya has Maya ASCII and Maya binary, 3D Max has 3ds and .max, Cinema 4D has .c4d, ZBrush has .ztl, and Blender has .blend, and so on and so on. Now, we're going to take a slight detour and talk about CAD modeling, or computer-aided design. CAD modeling is the other planet of 3D, which is used for engineering, architecture, and manufacturing. So it's used for everything from machine parts, to jewelry, to jet engines, to video game controllers. And maybe you can start to see that there's a bit of a visual difference from what we were looking at before. CAD is used for making real things, and giving robots and machines and cutters and mills the instructions and information needed to sculpt or mold these components. So pretty much everything that you see in the real world most likely exists on somebody's computer as a 3D CAD file. By comparison, if we take a look at a polygonal model of a car shown with its wireframe, and as you can see, this model is made out of triangles. And hopefully you can kind of start to see that it's a little rough around the edges. And that's because it is. You see, polygonal models are meant to be shown on screens, whether that's an animation in the film or a video game. The 3D model is ultimately converted to pixels, but a CAD model needs to be accurate. If you're making jet engine parts or race car parts, you need mathematical precision, and that's what CAD is. The perfect analogy can actually be found in 2D. Here we have two 2D circles. As you can see, they're quite different. The one on the left is made up of pixels, a rasterized image, but the one on the right is vector, made out of curves. You can think of polygons in CAD as the same difference. Polygons are made out of polys, CAD is made out of math. And here's an actual 3D comparison. This is the same shape, the left side is interpreted in polygons, the right side interpreted by CAD. You can try to increase the polygon count to get a little smoother to make it look like the CAD model, but in the physical world, it'll never be as accurate as the CAD model. Traditionally, these have been some of the most common 3D programs. We have AutoCAD, Revit, SolidWorks, Fusion 360, and Moi 3D, as well as Rhino and Onshape. And in more recent times, we have a new contender, which is Plasticity, which is positioning itself to be a CAD tool for the artist. Of all of these programs, Fusion 360 and Moi 3D have kind of crossed that bridge where they're being used in films and video games. Before we continue, I want to touch on two really important concepts that are actually 2D based, but we use them in the 3D world. Even though we say we work in 3D, we actually use 2D files every day. The most common file types you'll see us use are PNG, TGA or Targa, and EXR. When we create an image in 3D, we generally save it as an EXR because it's the most robust file type in existence. One of the key concepts that I want to communicate to you is this black and white gradient. The black and white gradient, or ramp, can be used as a substitute for the numbers 0 to 100. You can think of it as an off and on light switch, where black means it's off and white means it's on. And this is especially useful for masking. So in this example, the brighter the color, the more present. The darker the color, the more absent. And we use black and white masks for everything. Here you can see that we're controlling where the scratches appear, indicated by the white areas, and the absence of the scratches are in the dark areas. The second fundamental concept I want to express to you is RGB. In 3D, we work in RGB, which is called additive color, as opposed to subtractive color, which is used in printing. So additive color is RGB, red, green, and blue, and subtractive color is CMYK, or cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Every digital colored image is made up of 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And it's the additive mixing of those colors that give us all the range of color. So as you can see here on the left, we have this beautiful mountain range and a barn, and then you can see the content of its split channels of red, green, and blue separately. Here's a frame from a video I took with a Sony FX3. And as you can see, we can split this into the red channel, which is black and white, green channel, black and white, and blue channel, black and white. So as you can see, these 3 images, when added up together, results in a full colored image. And even though they look similar, there are differences in the images. Let's compare, for example, the blue to the red. As you can see in the blue, the sky is a lot lighter, which means the presence of something, the presence of blue. Whereas in the red, there's less red in the sky than there is in the blue, so we get a bit of a difference. Another example would be to look at the green channel and notice that the field is slightly brighter than, say, the blue channel. And that's because, obviously, if you look at the full colored image, the field is green, so there would be the most green in that area. And even though the images look a little different, there are similarities, and that's because white is the presence of all 3 colors, and darkness is the absence of all 3 colors. So even though they look a little different, the contrast is still readable across all 3 channels. Okay, so why is this important? This means that you can take a picture of a pizza, a picture of a pineapple, and a picture of a dog, and put the pizza in the red channel, the pineapple in the green channel, and the dog in the blue channel, and add them all together to get this. And this is a very common technique, especially in video game studios. Essentially what you're doing is you're merging 3 images into one. That is a massive optimization. So for 1/3 the cost in terms of hard drive space, in terms of draw calls, you're getting all of the same information. And when this data is needed, the shader or game engine doesn't see this monstrosity of an image. Instead, it just selects the channel data that it needs. So we've made the jump from 2D to 3D. Let's take a look at some samples of how that played out in real life. In 1990, or 35 years ago, we had one of the best games of all time, Super Mario World. This was a 2D, sprite-based side-scroller. This was the look of most video games at the time. And to this day, this game has a certain charm and shine that will never diminish. But in 1996 arrived Super Mario 64. For people of my generation, I can't express to you how novel this was, to be able to look 360 degrees around at the world. I was looking at this exact shot back in 1996 in a Walmart just out of Montreal, Quebec. Both adults and children stood in awe, mesmerized by what they were seeing. What was novel at the time was that you could spin the camera any which way you wanted. What really stood out to me is that you could look behind Mario as he ran forward in the other direction. You could see his face. For the first time, you had full control of what you got to look at. We had no knowledge of the 3D games that would come out over the next 30 years. This was peak, at least for video games. In June of 1993 came Jurassic Park. It wasn't the first movie to ever have 3D in it, but it was one of the most believable and convincing computer-generated characters of all time. I knew when I saw this movie that I would be a 3D artist. I wanted to understand what I was looking at and how it was done. It also can't be overstated how challenging it was to pull off at that time. This team of 3D artists are complete legends. They didn't Google it, they didn't YouTube it, they invented it. You may laugh at this UI and think, wow, this UI is ancient. But actually there's a point to take away here. Our hardware and our software today is basically like alien technology compared to what they had. But the logic of 3D points in space is still the same. Personal anecdote, I was lucky enough to visit ILM back in 2009. These are some very low megapixel photographs of the miniature T-Rex animatronic. And as a Jurassic Park fanboy, I was geeking out. This is their office in San Francisco, and I also got to see some absolutely sick Davy Jones sculptures, which you cannot leave out in a discussion about 3D. In 2006, we got Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest. To this day is one of the most incredible 3D character performances of all time, right next to Gollum. I know we're jumping back and forth in time here, but I have to go through some of these milestones. In 1994, we got one of the very first fully 3D animated episodic TV shows, Reboot. I don't know how popular or well known the show is for Americans because it's a Canadian TV show, but as a Canadian kid, this was awesome. We got Bob, Dot, and Enzo protecting the mainframe from the user. Here's a picture of me and my little brother at Pixar. We got to do the full campus tour. This was 16 years ago. They were working on Up and Toy Story 3 at the time. We got to see some work in progress. I can't speak for what the studio culture is like today, but at the time, the animators had built a treehouse above their desks because they were allowed that creative freedom. They also had a cereal room, which had every kind of cereal imaginable. And I ran into Pete Sohn, who I absolutely love from Iron Giant days. This was awesome. Speaking of the GOAT, Pixar came out with Toy Story in 1995. This was the first full-length 3D animated feature film. In many ways, this marked the beginning of the end for 2D feature films. And with each film, Pixar just kept getting better and better, pushing the technology, pushing the shaders, pushing the animation, the lighting. In 1999 came Toy Story 2. And already you can see the subtle improvements in what was possible. In 2001 came Monsters Inc., and from this screenshot alone, you can see the massive improvement in the hair systems. Hair, or what we call groom, is notoriously challenging, especially for that time. What we're seeing here are not polygons, but millions of curves that are shaped and guided. In 2003 came Finding Nemo, and the rendering of beautiful light at ocean depths would push the technology to the extreme. Then, in 2004 came what I consider Pixar's absolute masterpiece in The Incredibles. Pixar had been building to this moment for a long time. Their first feature film to really show off human characters. To me, The Incredibles set the standard for 3D character performance, acting, and expression. By this point, Pixar had mastered every domain of 3D. Hair, cloth simulation, rendering, lighting, subsurface scattering, the list goes on. And 20 years later, this movie still holds up. And here are the graphics of today. This is a model of Tyrion by one of my favorite 3D artists, Marlon Nunez. Absolutely stunning realism. What's really improved over the years is the sheer volume of information that we can render now. The detail in the hair, the skin, the pores, and what used to be a studio effort can now be done in the comfort of your own home. One person, one computer. Today, both the hardware and the software is easily available for anyone to get. But that's not to diminish the skill. It takes a lot of knowledge, training, patience. It's not enough to just know the programs, you have to have an eye. Here's a close-up example of just how beautiful our hair systems are now. And I think it's really important to appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into this. To explain it briefly, the way it works is that you're not placing each individual hair. The first step is that you paint a black and white mask on the model to indicate where you want hairs to grow. The second step is that you style hand-placed hair guides that dictate how the hair should move and flow. This is how you achieve manual control of how the hairs look. The hair tools then interpolate between these guides to generate thousands or millions of hair fibers. The artist then applies modifiers to further shape the hair by adding clumping, randomness, waviness, curling, flyaways, and varying length and thickness. It's worth mentioning that not every 3D project needs to be a character or a human. There's also what we call hard surface modeling, which is the modeling of solid forms that don't deform. Machines, armor, robots, gear, sci-fi vehicles, planes, trucks, buildings. Organic and hard surface are sometimes considered separate skills because they have different considerations and workflows, but it's totally up to you if you choose to specialize or do both. Here is a top tier example of what we call a digi double, or a digital double of a real actor or person. This is a screenshot from Blade Runner 2049 and an absolutely incredible result. As good as studios are, they're not infallible. Here are some examples of what audiences have claimed might have missed the mark for what is known as the uncanny valley. When a result looks human, but is maybe ever so slightly off. But as I said, there's so much more you can do outside of characters alone. Every step of the 3D process is a different role on the team. A lot of movies have 3D and VFX that you're simply not aware of. Here's the car scene from Sicario. I didn't even know that these vehicles were 3D. Not to mention set extensions, where the foreground and midground may be shot practically, but everything beyond that is CG. Almost all of this work that we've looked at so far is what we call pre-rendered, where we typically render at 24 frames per second. The benefit of pre-rendered is that you can throw millions and millions of polygons at the screen and it'll be just fine. On the other hand, video games are a different beast and operate in real time. There are a lot more technical limitations in a video game. For one, all of the 3D elements need to be rendered at 60 frames per second. This means that optimization is crucial. A drastically lower poly count, smaller texture sizes, fewer objects in the scene, and a limited distance. Video games are all about making graphics look as good as possible while balancing performance. Obviously, there's so much that you can do with 3D, but I always like to make the point that stylized works are not necessarily easier to do than the more realistic stuff. There may be aspects that get a little bit more simplified, but on a technical level, it's actually executing pretty much the same workflow as a realistic style. Not to mention that stylized animated work can have additional challenges to do with appeal, deformation, advanced rigs, and really pushing the limits of what's possible. And so all I'm really saying is when you see a movie like Frozen and you see a visual effect like this, do not dismiss it just because it's an animated film. Because on a technical level, it's on par, if not more challenging than something like this out of Dune. Which is obviously also a badass movie, don't get me wrong. Now you may be wondering, how did we get here? How did we get this level of quality all of a sudden? How do you go from these basic primitive boxes and shapes to this hyper-realistic soldier on the right? And how do we get so much realism in the details and the materials of the fabric? As you can see, we've come a long way from the Mario 64 days. And the answer is really digital sculpting. ZBrush has made it possible to effectively add unlimited amounts of detail into your 3D model. As opposed to polygonal box modeling where you have to extrude every edge, ZBrush made it possible to make 3D modeling closer to working with real clay in real life. ZBrush artists of today are sculptors. The medium just happens to be digital. And over the years, the tools just keep getting better and better to the point that there really is nothing holding us back anymore. If you want to create hyper-detailed robot models, go for it. The only thing holding you back is yourself. And here are some examples of what I think are absolutely peak. It's fantastic. It's just stunning work. Whether you want to do something more organic and biological or hard surface and organic, ZBrush can cover both with slight tweaks to the workflow. One of ZBrush's biggest strengths is that it can smoothly work with a massive amount of geometry. We're talking millions and millions of polygons. There are several tools that you can use to sculpt with, but ZBrush is really the king, and any piece of professional artwork that you see that looks like this is most likely using ZBrush. While you can create textures inside of ZBrush, it's primarily for the sculpting and modeling of the 3D form. The rendering, hair, textures, and shading are generally done in other programs. So how do you go from a classic clay 3D render to a more detailed looking realistic object? This is shifting more into what we call surfacing. We have our 3D form established, now we want to make it look super real. How do they do that, and what tools do we use to make it? And what determines if something is super realistic or stylized? How do we go from this clay render to this? This is through the part of the workflow that we call look development. Look development entails texturing, shading, grooming, and lighting. Here's our boy Andy from Toy Story, and there's about a 25-year gap between these screenshots. As you can probably see, there's a bit of a visual upgrade between the two. Notice the introduction of a slightly reddish glow of his ear on the right, whereas there's nothing but a hard plasticky feel on the left. This is what is known as subsurface scattering, and it really helps to make 3D models feel more fleshy and organic. What's happening is, as light penetrates the skin, it bounces around and some of it exits out as a glow. And because humans are filled with blood, we get that kind of reddish glow. In this example, you can see the effects of subsurface scattering in action. On the left-hand side, we have very low subsurface scattering values applied, and as we progress through each photo, we increase the subsurface scattering, to the point where by the end, we start to see almost a glow around the orbit of the eye, not to mention a complete softening of the shadows of the ear. Notice that the harsh black shadows of the first image have all but disappeared. While the materials definitely look more soft and fleshy now, they almost look a little too soft. So it's one of those cases where more isn't necessarily better, and you have to balance it. Here's some more examples of subsurface scattering seen in the real world, and as you can see, it generally occurs in the thinnest areas of skin. Subsurface scattering is just one of many features that helps 3D models look more realistic. It's not only used for skin, but other semi-translucent materials like wax, marble, and plastic. Subsurface scattering happens on the shader level. A shader is a set of parameters that instructs the renderer how light should react when it hits a surface. As I sort of mentioned earlier, a 3D model is just a gray mass. It requires a shader and texture inputs to make it look like a convincing object. While we can certainly get a lot of detail from the sculpt, like wrinkles, cracks, scratches, it's the shader and textures working together, reacting to light, that really brings it to life. Here's one of my absolute favorite examples of what look development can do for your model. Here we have the siren from Alberto Mielgo's Jabaro. You can see the incredible impact that the look development pass has on the model. This piece, by the way, was just spectacular, like a stylized painterly realism. The 3D pipeline looks something like this. First, you start with some approved 2D concept art. That goes into modeling. At different stages during the modeling process, the asset then gets passed on to the other departments. It doesn't have to be fully complete. To some degree, all of the following tasks can happen at the same time. Rigging is the art of turning that character into a puppet that the animators can control. Texturing includes all detail maps, including color. Shading is how the surface will react to light, and grooming, which is hair. Animation has a dependency on rigging. You can't really animate until you have a rig, but you can begin blocking an animation even with an incomplete rig. Once all those stages are done and the shots have been animated, it gets passed on to lighting. And finally, once all that is approved, it gets passed on to rendering, where the computers do the number crunching. Visually, the pipeline looks something like this. You have your model and your sculpt, you do your textures and your groom, then you do your shader and your lighting. I've said this word a few times now, but rendering is the calculation of light to produce the final image. Because the sun is such a massive object in space compared to Earth, you can think of all the light rays that hit the planet as being parallel. It's also far more intense than any man-made light that we have. When light rays hit a surface, some of that is reflected, depending on how smooth the surface is. This is called a specular reflection. Conversely, when light rays hit a surface that is uneven, they bounce and scatter in different directions. This is called a diffuse reflection, and results in a far less shiny looking surface. There are several other behaviors of light as it hits a surface, in this case in varying degrees of transparency. The behaviors of light can be categorized like this. In this example, when white light hits this Lego block, you can see that some of it gets absorbed, but a portion of it gets reflected. In this case, the red light is being reflected into our eyes. And so the perceived color of each of these Lego blocks is not what the Lego block absorbed, but what the Lego block reflected. Reflection, which I think we're all familiar with, and refraction, where light rays pass through a surface and bend the light as a result, leading to distorted images, for example in this glass cup. The behavior of light and its mechanics can be captured in an equation. This is Pixar's rendering algorithm. When you watch a 3D movie, this is what you see, a complete image, a kid with some balloons. But the way that the computer sees it is like this. And the renderer's job is to trace the path of all the light rays as they bounce around the world and into the camera, to calculate what the color of each individual pixel will be. It is said to take 5 to 6 hours to render a single frame for a Pixar movie. All of these calculations are done on massive render farms in cool, dark rooms, open 24 hours. So that is the process for going from the image on the left to the image on the right. When it comes to pre-rendering for film or animation or VFX, these are the top software tools for today: Arnold, V-Ray, Redshift, Octane, and RenderMan. For real-time video games, Unreal and Unity. Let's talk about HDRI. HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Image. In the photography world, HDRI generally refers to any photograph that is taken with multiple exposures, then stacked together to create an HDRI file. What this allows for is a far greater dynamic range. So if you look at the photograph on the left, you can see that the sky is blown out and overexposed, leading to almost a completely white background. However, on the image on the right, you can see that we get a lot more cloud detail. This is desirable, and this is made possible by having multiple exposures stacked together. But in the 3D world, HDRI generally works in tandem with what we call IBL, or image-based lighting. In the 3D world, an HDRI generally refers to a 360-degree image with high dynamic range that is used to light your scene. In this beautiful example by Jorgen HDRI, you can see how realistic the lighting is on these 3D spheres, both with a high exposure and a low exposure. There are a few ways to capture 360-degree HDRI photographs. The simplest way is with a 360-degree camera, like the Theta Z1, which I use. But the highest quality way is with any full-frame sensor camera, a wide-angle lens, and a pano tilt head on a tripod, like the Ninja Nodal 6. This allows you to rotate the camera at set intervals to capture the 360. Your camera also needs automatic exposure bracketing, which allows you to take multiple photos at different exposures with the same click. This is what gives you the dynamic range. And lastly, you'll need a stitching program like PTGui or Nuke to put those images together to create a 360-degree photo. HDRIs make it possible to capture believable mood and reflections in your 3D scenes. Now, let's talk about textures. And I know this video is getting long, but bear with me because we're almost there. Textures are incredibly important. This is one of my favorite images to describe what a texture does for your 3D model. Here we have 16 different textures and their effects on a basic sphere. These textures are all common inputs for today's shaders. For example, we have base color, sometimes called diffuse, sometimes called albedo, but effectively they all do the same thing. Base color is the local color of your 3D object before light influence. So as you can see here, the base color is giving us a brick texture for this ball. Ambient occlusion is the mini shadow that happens when two objects are in close proximity. So if you put your hand and you put it close to your desk, you'll notice that a little shadow forms because the light has a harder time getting in between your palm and the desk. That's ambient occlusion, and it occurs everywhere. Normal is a description of which way your surface is pointing. Roughness, as we talked about before, is how smooth your surface is. Do the light rays bounce off cleanly, or do they disperse and scatter? And so on and so on. This is the function of texture maps. They control the properties of the material. In this example by Sefki Ibrahim, we have Jack Black and his various texture maps. As you can see, the diffuse is the local color. So you get all the discoloration of the skin pores and blemishes and marks. And it's not about looking good in isolation at this stage. What you're trying to do is feed the correct information to the shader to create a realistic result. And once you've combined the effect of all these textures, this is the result. Sefki is one of the top 3D character artists in the world, and his results are stunning. This is the result of executing on all those different stages of the 3D pipeline that we discussed and building towards a beautiful image. The top two software tools for texturing are Mari and Substance Painter. Mari had a firm grip monopoly on texturing for film due to its unique ability to paint across UDIMs, which I'll talk about in a moment. Substance Painter, on the other hand, was more commonly used for video games, but nowadays Substance Painter's features have caught up to Mari, so now really we have two dominant software packages. But there's more to texturing than just realism. There are a number of extremely popular games that employ the style of hand-painted textures. The number one that comes to my mind is World of Warcraft. Everything in this game is painted by hand. Every environmental tiling texture from mud, grass, leaves, gravel, stone, rock, everything is done by hand. Whereas realistic texturing sometimes uses real photographs for the detail, pictures of leather, pictures of wood, pictures of stone. In stylized hand painting, everything has to be synthesized by the artist. Everything is an interpretation by the artist. And I have great respect and admiration for this style of art because it's extremely human, handmade art. Not to mention the skill it takes to render such a variety of materials. To me, hand-painted textures are the modern-day equivalent of figurine painting. The top two texturing programs for a hand-painted style to this day are Photoshop and 3D Coat. Games like World of Warcraft are textured with these two programs. 3D Coat is a similar program to Substance Painter because it allows for 3D texturing, but I would argue it has better tools and a better color palette for hand-painted stylized texturing. You can think of it as 3D Photoshop. Now we've talked about normals, but normal maps are for a slightly different purpose. Normal maps have this distinct color range. As you can see from this sphere, each of these hues represents a slightly different angle. For example, you can see the correlation between the colors of the sphere and the colors of this tiled pattern. This kind of greeny teal color represents the upper left and the pink the lower right. By being able to capture all of these different 3D facing angles into a 2D texture, we're able to cheat the system a little bit and add a lot more detail to our models. Instead of sculpting in all this gravelly rock detail into geometry, which would be computationally expensive, you can cheat it by baking it into a normal map instead. As a result, the light will react as if these little rocks are actually there, but it's not baked into the geometry. It's baked into a normal map texture. This was the example in my formative years where it really clicked for me. This is the Master Chief's model from Halo 2, and as you can see, it doesn't quite look as detailed as we're used to seeing it. When you add a bump map to this model, you can see that we get the detail that we expect. That's the Chief. A bump map was the predecessor to the normal map. So all these little details on the chief's armor are just an illusion. They're not actually there baked into the geometry. But this technique is being used in video games to this day. And with the diffuse texture applied, we get the color. In this example, you can see that we just have the base color applied to this geometry, and now you can see the effects of the normal map. But really what you're seeing is just an illusion. You're seeing how the light is reacting to it, because we've captured the facing angle of that geometry and put it into a 2D texture. I want to really drive home this point about normal maps, because they're very important, especially for video games. So here we've got two models. One of them is the high poly, and the other is the low poly with a normal map texture. Can you tell which one is which? While they do look similar, and they're reacting to the light in a similar way, the one on the left has a lot more dimension, and casts shadows slightly differently. That's because the model on the left is the high poly, and has actual extrusions and indents, whereas the model on the right is the fake. You can tell because the indents are not really digging into the model, and the shadows in those little circular holes are not reacting nearly the same. And here's what these two models actually look like underneath. The model on the left is made up of almost 44,000 polygons, whereas the model on the right is made up of 162. Way more efficient. This is one of the main reasons why normal maps are used in the first place. It cuts down on a lot of polygons. At render time, the model on the right gives the illusion of detail, but it's not actually part of the geometry. The process of transferring this detail from the high poly to the low poly we call baking. In this case, normal map baking. And the vehicle for transferring that information to the low poly is the normal map. And a normal map looks just like this. Almost every 3D program can bake normal maps nowadays, but two of the most prominent that you'll see are Marmoset Toolbag and Substance Painter. So hopefully you now know what a normal map is, what it can do for your models, and why it's used. Nowadays, for super realistic skin detail, it's not necessarily sculpted in, but we use scans. Websites like Texturing.xyz allow artists to buy scanned skin detail that they can then project or paint onto their models. You can get very good results by sculpting in these details by hand, manually. But it's very hard to beat scans of real skin captured in all of its complexity and variation. 3D scans of models are generally done in camera cages with photogrammetry. Basically, you surround the model with cameras and they take synchronized pictures at the same time. Working with real scan data is a great way to improve your sculpting, but camera cages are extremely expensive and are usually a dedicated service, unless of course you can afford to buy 300 full-frame cameras. Here's a glimpse of the process of creating a digi-double for a high-budget feature film. On the left is the real Hugh Jackman captured by the light cage, and on the right is the CG render. Obviously, the reason for doing this is so that they can compare the 3D model to the reality, and see where it could be improved. They're also checking to see if the model holds up under different lighting conditions, because ultimately the digi-double will be used in many different lighting scenarios. So in summary, textures are massively important, and they are what take a gray clay model and make it look like a real object. And just to really drive this point home, here's an example of a gun I modeled with nothing on it, seen here with ambient occlusion, metalness, roughness, opacity, base color, and the final result when you add all these different textures together. The textures really help to bring the model to life, but one of the prerequisites for texturing that we haven't talked about is what we call UV unwrapping. UV unwrapping, or UVing, is the process of taking your 3D model and flattening it out into a 2D space. To use our earlier analogy, it's the process of taking our 3D model and sending it back to 2D. The same way you can gift wrap any 3D object with 2D wrapping paper, you can equally unwrap it, or take the 3D object and make it flat. UVing is taking your 3D model and slicing it into flat sheets. In this example, each of these large quadrants are one texture file, and multiple texture images we call UDIMs, and each one has unique identities. In this case, we're looking at texture 1001, 1002, 1011, 1012. There aren't actually 1,000 textures. This is just where the numbers start. So really we have 4 textures. Effectively what we're doing is giving every point on the 3D model a 2D coordinate, and this is necessary in order to texture it. So here's my Spider-Man, and as you can see, I've given every part of him a 2D coordinate, and this allows me to texture him. You may have seen the square checker pattern before. This is for diagnostic purposes, and it tells us if there's any stretching or distortion in the UV. And once a model has UVs, you're freely able to paint on it. In this case, I'm painting inside of Mari. Shading. Shading are the instructions for the renderer on how light should react when the rays hit the surface of an object. In this case, I was trying to mimic the style of the movie Spider-Verse, and as you can see, there is nothing realistic about this. The highlight splits up into a halftone pattern to mimic comic books. The fall off of the shadow is banded, and finally, as the form turns into shadow, we have a diagonal hatching pattern. This is all the work of the shader. Here we can see what a shader actually looks like. We have a bunch of nodes that plug into other nodes that calculate to produce the result we see in the upper right. Fundamentally, we're looking at math. A lot of the times, nodes are simply manipulating math. Not even necessarily complex math, simple things like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And the end result, when used on a real model, looks like this. So as you can hopefully see now, your textures plug into a shader, which become instructions for your renderer on how the surface should react when light rays strike a surface. In terms of modeling 3D clothing, Marvelous Designer is really the leader in this area, particularly for the industry. The program works by cutting out real sewing patterns, stitching them together, and applying gravity. The results are actually incredible, and because it's applying real physics to your models, it often comes up with results that maybe you couldn't imagine or do by hand. It can take out a lot of the guesswork, and at the very least, it can set you up with a solid foundation, which you can then continue to sculpt on. It also has a variety of preset parameters that mimic different material types, like denim, silk, cotton, leather, but a lot of the times in 3D, clothing is still done by hand. It obviously takes a lot of time, patience, and study to get to this level, but here's an excellent example by character artist Jesse Sandifer. Rigging. Rigging is an absolutely essential part of the process to make anything move. I think the best way to explain rigging is like this. The puppet is made by modeling, texture, grooming, and shading. The controls of the marionette are the rigger, and the person controlling it all is the animator. So once again, we have the actor or performer and the animator. The controls are made by the rigger, and everyone else makes the puppet. Without the rig, you can't really control the puppet. In practical terms, the rig shows up in your 3D viewport as these colored shapes. All of these little shapes are controls to manipulate the puppet. When you move a control, the underlying geometry follows with it. And if you keyframe these positions, now you get movement. Here's a great example by the Blizzard Cinematics team. This is a rig of the character Asmodan from the Diablo trailer. Rigging is such an impressive job because it's one part artistic and another part technical. It helps to know anatomy, it really helps to know animation, it also really helps to know some coding in Python. But as you can see, every 3D character you've ever seen has an underlying rig. These shapes and controls are what the animators see every day, but at render time, they disappear. They're invisible. Rigs can become extremely complex, and is one of the areas I alluded to when I said animated films have a bigger challenge than reality, because of how far animated characters can be pushed. Here, I've made the simplest arm rig imaginable. As you can see, I've got my arm mesh, I've got some circles, and I have some blue sticks. The model itself, we often call the mesh or the geometry. The shapes themselves, we call control shapes, and the sticks are called joints or bones. These are the key components of a rig. The way it works is that we position these joints or bones inside of the geometry. We then attach these bones and the geometry together in a step that we call skinning. This makes it so that wherever the bones move, the mesh will follow with it. These black and white gradients dictate how much influence these bones have on the surrounding geometry. So again, the brighter the value, the more influence the bone has on that area. And the darker the value, the less influence it has. So in this example, the bone on the right currently has 0 influence on the hand. So if that bone moves, the hand will not move. We call this skin weights. And anytime we have bones connected to geometry, we have skin weights. Now that the rig is built, it's time for animation. Animation is an art form in itself, and of all the topics we talk about today, it's probably the least nerdy. And by nerdy, I mean you don't actually need to know that much 3D. What makes a good animator is not your technical skill with the software, it's your eye. You need to be an actor and a performer. Understanding and unlocking physicality goes a long way. The skills to be a great animator are in your instincts. Dance, martial arts, sports, maybe even military training can all arm you with an understanding of movement that are your real tools. You also have to know how to act. In animation school, we studied physical comedy, Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, Robin Williams, communicating story and emotion through movement. The real challenge is mastering what is known as the 12 principles of animation. These are concepts that were originated and refined by Disney's 9 Old Men. This was the SEAL Team 6 of animation. And while the 9 Old Men had mastered these concepts, it wasn't until 1981 that a book was published called The Illusion of Life, in which the 12 principles of animation were formalized by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, 2 of the 9 Old Men. The 12 principles lay the foundation of modern animation as we know it. The 12 principles are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead action and pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, slow in and slow out, arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. While it might be easy to look at these drawings and think, wow, we're so far ahead of this now, nothing could be further from the truth. The industry standard tool for animation is Maya. I think a big reason for that is that the industry standard for rigging was also Maya, and so animation just followed suit. Practically speaking, 3D animation entails posing, keyframing, and tweaking those keyframes with the graph editor. In feature film and animation, animators typically work towards a set camera, a shot established by the layout, previs, or storyboard team. This means that they focus 100% of their efforts towards what you'll actually see in this shot. Video games are a little bit different because the player often has control of the camera, so it has to look good from 360 degrees. Video game animations are also more based on loops and repeated actions. Walk cycles, run cycles, reload animation, melee swings. But narrative animation contains full-on acting, dialogue, crying, emotions. In the old days, animators were simply actors with pencils. And if you go to any animation school, as I did, you will take acting classes. And brother, it is not easy. Animators are always trying to bring a little bit of reality and truth to their work. So it's incredibly common to record video reference of yourself performing the actions of your character, and use this as a springboard for posing, timing, and capturing a sense of weight. So as you can hopefully see, the role of the animator is quite unique. It is the essential task to breathe life into your 3D models. Otherwise, everything is just a T-pose, and that gets old real quick. We almost have all our pieces together, but we're missing a big one, and that's environments. Building believable, massive scale environments in 3D has unique challenges. You don't just have artistic and creative challenges anymore. You have a dataset problem. To recreate a believable reality, you need near infinite detail. These are some shots from Blade Runner 2049, a dystopian sci-fi Los Angeles, California. In a presentation by Atomic Fiction, one of the VFX vendors who worked on the city, it was said that some of these city shots have as many as 900 billion polygons. How do you not only render, but iterate and light and work on a scene that complex? The 4 common elements for every environment are buildings, terrain, trees, and water. And all of those take a ton of geometry to execute. The old practice of digital map painting is still very much a thing. But not in every scenario. A lot of the times the environment is completely 3D. These environments are far bigger than most 3D applications could ever open. This is where specialized tools come into play. Katana by the Foundry was made for this exact purpose. Katana is officially defined as a look development and lighting software, but it's very special because of what they call deferred geo-loading and processing. What that means is that geometry is not loaded into the scene like it typically does in most 3D programs, where you can edit and manipulate the model, the UVs. Instead, you work with proxies in the viewport, and the real geometry only gets loaded in at render time. What it can do is build the world, and take as many assets as you can imagine, then apply shaders and lighting. As a result, massive scenes can be loaded instantly, and you can immediately start working. Atomic Fiction described how they use a procedural dirt system and a single shader to texture the entire city, something that would take ridiculous amounts of time to do by hand, building by building. The unique features of Katana made it possible for only 3 artists to create all the 3D elements for this entire shot. For terrain, there are a few options. Gaea by Quadspinner is a node-based terrain generator. The concept is pretty simple. You start with a square terrain, and then you apply these different nodes that have different effects, such as erosion. You can add canyons, craters, dunes, mountains, water, snow, ridges, but then Houdini is also fantastic at terrain. Once you have terrain, it's important to have a geometry scattering tool that allows you to instance trees, plants, and other vegetation across that landscape. Once again, Houdini has tools for that too. One of the leading tools for creating trees is a program called SpeedTree, popular in both video games and VFX. Ultimately, for creating realistic environments and all the detail that implies, you need to be able to manage massive amounts of assets and data. This will be the briefest point in this presentation because I think we all know what effects are. Effects are anything to do with particles and volumetrics. So pyro effects, fluid effects, glass, debris, magic, crowd simulation, smoke, sparks, embers, clouds, snow, blood. Effects covers a wide range of topics. It enhances everything. It's like adding salt to a steak. This is also where you'll find real innovation. This is the Lilith membrane portal from the Diablo 4 cinematic, made in Houdini. Effects like this have to be invented, as seen in this demo by Nima Savadi. There isn't a button in 3D that you just click and it does this for you. You have to invent it. And that's why it takes very intelligent people who often know math and programming to come up with solutions. This is why, at the highest level, Houdini is one of the most dominant programs. The nodes and operations in Houdini's toolkit makes this possible. And while it can seem like complete wizardry, never forget that the core principle are 3D points in space behaving a certain way across time. And by breaking down the logic of what you want step by step, you can accomplish incredible effects. The final topic of Chapter 0 is compositing. Almost all roads lead to compositing. All roads lead to Nuke. You can think of compositing as Photoshop for video. Even though all of our work was done in 3D, ultimately everything is rendered into 2D pixels. So at the end of the day, what you really need is something that can manipulate every single pixel to what you want it to be. And that's what Nuke does. everything ultimately ends up in Nuke. It is the culmination of every visual department, combining the 3D with your actors, plate photography, effects, unifying the lighting, color. Compositing is the final control. And I actually believe that compositing will become one of the most important skills going into the future. So some of the key tasks for compositing are removing green screen, rotoscope, rotopainting, camera tracking, 2D planar tracking, color correction, and so on and so on. Compositors are really the end of the line, other than the colorist. But the colorist doesn't determine if the dragon's in the shot or not. The challenge is not putting CG elements on top of plate photography. The real challenge is when you have elements in the plate photography that need to go in front of the CG elements. That requires a very meticulous frame-by-frame mask of that element. This is what we call rotoscoping. Here we have some VFX by Pixelmondo where Jon Snow touches Drogon for the first time. This requires that Jon Snow and his furry coat have to be rotoscoped in order to appear in front of Drogon, which we know is a CG dragon. But this is movie magic. This is what sells the illusion. This is what makes it possible. And it takes way more work than most audiences realize. Camera tracking is the prerequisite for combining computer graphics with live action footage. To put it simply, the movement of the real camera needs to be recreated in the 3D environment. They need to match 1-to-1 within less than 1 pixel of error. That way, your 3D looks like it actually sits in the world. And that's exactly how the Zerg got in my kitchen. I think I'm setting the world record for the number of StarCraft references in one tutorial. My kitchen is not always that messy, by the way. I was doing a skit. Camera tracking can be done in both Nuke and Blender, although arguably Nuke should be far superior. But the industry standard for camera tracking have long been these three softwares: 3D Equalizer, SynthEyes, and PF Track. At least one of these have been used in almost every movie you've ever seen that had 3D elements. Silhouette is a dedicated rotoscope software considered the best in the industry, although rotoscope can be done in other programs as well, such as Nuke. As a matter of fact, BorisFX makes some amazing industry standard tools. They have great tutorials, and these are probably the three that you should at least know about: SynthEyes for camera tracking, Silhouette for rotoscope, and Mocha Pro for 2D camera tracking, and a lot more. BorisFX has some amazing tools for compositing, available as standalone apps or plugins for other software. Now you may wonder, sure, use compositing when you're mixing real footage with 3D, but what if I'm working on something that's 3D entirely? Do I need to use compositing at all? And the answer is absolutely. What you get out of a renderer is a physics-based approach to how light behaves. But that doesn't necessarily mean it matches your vision. Sure, it's mathematically correct, but in the words of George Lucas, is it romantically correct? Meaning, can we push things to make them look better? By default, most renderers do not include glow. That's a separate pass on top of the image. Glow, blur, bokeh, focus or defocus, film grain, chromatic aberration, and lens flares are typically things that are added in compositing. They are not calculated on the render level. And this actually gives us a lot more control as opposed to if those things were baked into the beauty pass. So simply put, 100% yes, if you plan to do full CG renders, absolutely compositing is part of that workflow. Now, obviously, compositing is a film and animation specific thing. In the traditional sense, it's not part of video games, but video games instead use engine post-processing effects. I could have mentioned this during the rendering section, but actually compositing is perfectly fine too, because AOVs are created during render time, but they're used by compositing. AOVs stands for Arbitrary Output Variables. Here, we have a render of some cars. The final image of your render is what is called the beauty pass, what your image should look like. But AOVs are additional outputs that the compositor can use to get better control to manipulate the image in compositing. So in addition to the beauty pass, if you enable these AOVs, in this case, I have 13 additional AOVs for a total of 14 images. All of these images are stored inside the same EXR file as layers. That is why EXR files are so powerful. They can store all of this data in one file. The reason for this, again, is control. So for example, here we have the diffuse pass. This is just the color. Here we have the specular pass, so we get all of the highlights and reflections. And again, the reason for this is that you have direct control over the strength of these different layers. So let's say I wanted a slightly brighter highlight in these reflections. I can bump that up by affecting only the highlights and not anything else. I have complete control of every layer. Some of these calculations are taking place when you render anyway. They are part of the calculation of how the renderer gets to the final image. Some of these AOVs look completely white, but there's actually data inside. The pixel values of an EXR file can go way beyond 1 and way below 0. So these AOV passes are what give compositors complete control of any CG images. So that concludes my overview of 3D, how it's done, what it is, and how it's made. I hope that gave you a better sense of the landscape, the 3D terms to look out for, provide some understanding, and maybe give you a bit of a taste of the different specializations that are out there that you might be interested to pursue. The reason I made this video is that I help a lot of people on the side, just as a hobby. Honestly, it kind of keeps me sharp. And I find even if people have been to school or are currently in school, are not being taught the fundamentals of 3D. They're not even being taught the bigger picture. And so the purpose for this video is that I'm starting up a brand new Learn Maya series. So my hope with this video was to mitigate some of that confusion before we even get started learning Maya. In conclusion, what is 3D? Points in space that are shaped like things that can move in a way that imitates life. How is it done? With math, physics, computer programming, artistry, and observation. Thank you for watching.